Hi, I'm Dr. Erin Keating, and this is my channel, Dr. Arinrung, where I talk about mainly sort of fantasy, other pop culture topics that have to do with my teaching, my research, and just in general things that I enjoy thinking about and writing about and speaking about, for fun on the internet. So today, I'm very happy to be back in the Malazan universe. For those of you who are subscribers to the channel, you of course know I am a big fan of the Malazan series in the Malazan world written by Steven Erikson and Ian Esselmont. And today I'm going to be looking at No Life Forsaken. So that is the second book in the Witness trilogy. I am going to start the video no spoilers. So if you haven't read it yet, stick around for a little bit if you'd like. I'm going to talk a little bit about that first, and then I will be going into heavy spoilers and I will absolutely let you know when that's happening. And of course, we'll put a timestamp below to also let you know there when the spoilers start. So to start with the non-spoiler section of this video, when this book came out in November, I believe it was, I was able to get it here in Canada. One of the big things that I love about following a long-running series is that you get to come back to it, right? It's been a while since we've had a new book in the Malazan world, and just being able to sort of pick that up and to be back into that sort of familiar place. And I'd almost say, for me as a fan of Malazan, almost like a comfort place. I know that might sound strange given how dark this series in this world tends to be, but I do very much find it in my rereads and when we have a new book that we can dive into to be very much a comfort read. I very much get that sense of just coming back, of coming home. So that's one of the things I really loved about this book when I first picked it up, and I've read it 3 times now, sort of in preparation for this video and sort of going over it and thinking about it. And so for those of you who perhaps haven't read it yet, but are interested in sort of what's going on in the Witness series, perhaps versus the Malazan Book of the Fallen and some of the other series, so there's a lot of things here for you. I think if you are a fan, right, of that Malazan Book of the Fallen, 10 books, one of the things is that, of course, there's many sort of references, throwbacks to things that happened in that series. We're about 20 years past that series at this point, and so, but there are sort of lots of times, of course, and certainly characters who come back and events that are referenced. And so this sort of connecting to that sort of epic 10 book reading experience, but in a series, and I'll see if those of you who have read Witness so far agree with me, that contains all of the elements we really loved about that series, but in a way that is, I'd say, faster paced. That's a little quicker, that's a little less philosophical. If you want that, go to Canas, which of course I also love, but they're doing sort of something different. And so it just feels like a continuation and yet also still something entirely new because of the different writing style, right? So there's a different feel to it, but even so, it's still very familiar and is very much like coming back to that world and sort of containing the things we loved. So what are those things we loved, or at least I love? Hopefully some of you share that with me. So I'm going to go through a couple of those in terms of how this book is touching on them. And the first thing has to do actually with geography, and I really love this symmetry. So like the original 10 that Erikson wrote, the first book of Witness started in Gettysburg in the same way that Gardens of the Moon does. And now the second one, No Life Forsaken, is in 7 cities, right? In Gdanispan specifically, but again, 7 cities, the second book, Dead House Gates of that main 10. So I enjoy that sort of symmetry, and I'll be interested to see if there's a reason for that or sort of a follow-up once we have the whole series of Witness. But I do enjoy this sort of, it's after, but that theme of repetition, that theme of things coming back, that was so important in the Big Ten, is very much sort of present here, and particularly in the relationship between the two series, which I think is done really well and is really exciting to see and I enjoy. So in this book, there's also a continuance of what I would say beloved themes that we had in sort of the first Witness book as well as this. So we have meddling of the gods, and I'm going to keep it vague, but we find some like new aspects of gods, new angles perhaps on gods that we thought we knew well, And so it brings sort of a complexity to these familiar characters in a way that might be surprising. And of course, the absurdity of the Marines banter, right? It wouldn't really be a Malazan book without the Marines and their banter. And it's almost sort of, this existential response to their complete lack of control or knowledge in terms of where they are in terms of the power structures. It actually reminds me in a lot of ways about that sort of absurdity of Samuel Beckett. Of course, Samuel Beckett took it to much more extremes, but just the sort of how does humankind deal with being thrown into things they have no control over, right? And having to make meaning of that, having to sort of be okay with that, and be more than okay, right? To actually sort of thrive in those conditions, thrive. And certainly, in terms of this particular Marines in this book, there's no Stillwater, who is definitely a standout from the first book in this series, possibly one of the funniest Marines I think Erikson has ever written. But I do really enjoy, in particular, the sappers, right? So Paul Crude and Fedlap, they have a lot of fun banter between them. They do some really unpredictable and ridiculous things, as one would hope of Marines, which is always a lot of fun. And then if you're looking for that sort of absurdity, we're also getting it with a new character, the High Priestess Shemal, who's a High Priestess of Bashaik. And her dialogue I actually really enjoyed because she seems to be very much in the tradition of seemingly ridiculous, seemingly drunk, but there's truth in there and there's understanding in there in a way that sort of reminds me almost of like that Shakespearean fool, right? Like the madness that speaks truth a little bit. So I really enjoyed that aspect as well. And if you're looking for that type of banter, that type of absurdity that we love so much in these Malazan novels. Another key theme for this book is religion. And this is huge, right? Because this one is set very much amidst the conflict of a swath of new religions, right? So we have Vashaik's version of the apocalyptic that's sort of growing. We have a religion, of course, growing around Karsa that we supposedly sort of part of the point of witness. There's Crow clan worshippers, there's followers of Leoman, and these are all in conflict and sort of clashing over the course of this. And we're most sort of with Vashaik's worshippers, they're used really to explore, as many other books in this series have, relationships between gods and their worshippers. And in particular, that sort of instability and like unpredictability of new gods and goddesses, right? And in this book in particular, using that in relation to rage, right? So this is in conversation with Deadhouse Gates, because you remember sort of the rage of the original Shaikh and the desert and these sorts of things. But it takes a different angle in this book, which I think is really interesting. But basically the idea being is that there's many different forms of rage in this. And so I'd say emotionally speaking, this book is really exploring different flavors of rage, if you will, and what they lead to and what they create and how they can control a person or how they can be controlled in particularly useful ways. And again, like the sort of existential element of this that I talk about in terms of the Marines banter and that sort of dealing with a lack of control, a lack of power, both of these things I think really resonate with our current situation right now. And I think that's one of the reasons that this book was something that I just really needed, if you will, when it came out in November, because those ideas and whatnot is something I think that a lot of people, including myself, are struggling with right now in regards to the current political situation, at least in North America. I'll just speak, for myself in terms of North American existence. The other theme picked up this book that I'm going to talk about in depth a little later in the video is the figure of the adjunct, right? And this has been an interest in the series since Gardens of the Moon, and that struggle between the individual person who is the adjunct and then the role in the structure of the empire, right? And exploring the toll that certain types of power have on a person and the sorts of sacrifices that it entails to fulfill that role, to take that place in a structure, and in particular, this sort of imperial structure, right? This structure of empire, this structure of expansion, and this military structure. Now we have to jump into the spoilers. So, first, I want to talk about the adjunct and representations of queerness in No Life Forsaken. Adjunct Incris Solet and Hadelin Balad's relationship is, to my mind, the first non-cartoonish or non-stereotypical depiction of queer men in Erikson's Malazan books, with Incris, as a gay man, and Hadelin being bisexual. Right, and so I think this is really important that we have sort of a, I complained perhaps a little bit in my video on sort of homosexual representation in the series, about there not being enough space for queer desire. And so this was nice to sort of pick up this book and see these two men clearly both loving and lusting after each other and being sort of obsessive and whatnot. And I think this is really well done because it's not too dominant, right? Because the series never centers romantic relationships, so it fits very well in terms of the book as a whole. It's an element, but not a focus. But their relationship allows Erikson to depict gay male desire for readers. So their relationship is used also to explore jealousy, and in particular, jealousy that's colored by a measure of biphobia on Incris's part in terms of how he actually sort of thinks about the women Hadelin has been sleeping of, and really this pain as well of intentionally driving a loved partner away. Like these things are explored through this relationship, but again, without ever centering the relationship, like keeping it on the same level as all of the other sort of relationships in the long series have been. This idea of the pain that's caused and the way that these two men sort of hurt each other and how that affects the relationship to their role. And this actually becomes quite clear when Hadelin later becomes adjunct and how he behaves after Incarus's death, right? The way he blames Ehrenfall for it, and that sort of almost very obsessively wants revenge, despite it not maybe being politically expedient. It's hard to say, but also despite knowing that it wasn't his fault and being told by multiple people that Incarus's death was not Ehrenfall's fault, right? So that's one of the things that this relationship, I think, is being used to explore really well. For me, what I really want to dive into is the way that it's being used to explore something that threads through the series throughout Gardens of Moon that I mentioned slightly earlier, and that's the impact of the role of the adjunct to the emperor on the individual who occupies that role and their relationships both to themselves and others that has been of interest, of course, to readers throughout this series. And so we have a third adjunct and then a fourth, sort of allowing us to explore these things even more and take those original ideas even further. I think, like with Tavor in the Book of the Fallen, who in many ways, has to, she hides her relationship with Tamber. And there are sort of some snide comments made about it, and I've talked about that in that other video. And then after Tamber's death, she shuts herself off from everyone. And I've thought about the ways that Erikson is using queerness, but the way he's using it to think about that outside status of the role of the adjunct, that the empress and the emperor, like that it thrusts upon people. And one of the big sort of things that this adds, or I'd say deepens in No Life Forsaken, is how very incompatible love is with the adjunct's position, right? This idea that the role, not the person, right? The adjunct is restricted from human emotion, restricted from individual desire. And recall all the way back in Gardens of the Moon, like adjunct Lauren's struggle between herself and her personal and emotional history in Gardens of the Moon, most notably in that dinner scene, right? When she meets Tattersail and realizes Tattersail's role in the burning of the mouse quarter and so in the death of her parents. And she demands to have her arrested and brought to justice. And this is a response coming from her rage, her anger, from that child she was during that time, with her parents being killed and herself being taken by the Malazans. And Taishrin's response to her demand is worth recalling here because it brings back the very incompatibility of feeling and the role. So this is what Taishrin says in response to her demanding this. Now, the woman named Lorne, the woman who was once a child, who once had a family, he looked upon the adjunct with anguish in his eyes. That woman does not exist. She ceased to exist the day she became the adjunct, right? So this idea that emotion has no role in this sort of structure. And that separation is something that I think is played with throughout the series and continues to be played with in No Life Forsaken. But in No Life Forsaken, we're seeing it now clearly with love, right? Because we actually get both Incarus and Hadelin's POVs in a way that we didn't, right? So with Adjunct Tavor, she's, of course, famously inscrutable. She reveals nothing about the woman beneath the role, even when she's seemingly working against Lazine and perhaps against the Empire. And Erikson emphasizes this, right, by not giving her to us, by not giving her POV, forcing us to see her through the eyes of those around her, keeping the reader at arm's length. I mean, in addition to the killing of her lover, which could be filed under Bury Your Gaze, and we're going to come back to that soon. The adoption of the children of the snake, who actually dub her mother, is another interesting, ironic gesture towards that structural over the personal of the adjunct that we're sort of exploring here. So, like, the mother label makes sense insofar that Tavor is responsible for the fate of those whom she's taking through the glass desert, but she demonstrates nothing of the emotion, right, of the nurturing elements that one might expect of the label. And so, in one sense, the use of the label shows its similarity to the role of the adjunct, in that the structural relationship alone does not necessitate the qualities that the individual is expected to bring to the role, right? So, this idea that role and emotion are two separable things. Certainly, they can come together in other cases, like motherhood. There are one or two positive versions of motherhood in the series, many negative ones, but they're not necessarily, linked, right? And with an adjunct, they can't be linked, right? The adjunct is the further element of that. And so that incompatibility between love and the adjunct is heightened in many ways in No Life Forsaken. Early on in the book, Hadelin himself cites Incarus's position as adjunct as the reason that he's been taking other lovers in the city, right? Like, rightly or wrongly, he believes that the adjunct's love for him is too much of a vulnerability for Incarus, right? In the sense that someone could get to Incarus through him if Incarus allows him to, prioritize that attachment. And there's some irony there because Hadelin himself seems to prioritize that attachment later. And then as things are falling apart, Incarus can actually be very much seen as sort of retreating into the role, hiding behind the role as the relationship falls apart, as he's dealing with the pain of just cutting off, Hadelin and keeping him as his guard, but not his lover, right? So there's this idea that they're struggling to have this at the start of the book, to make this work, but even at the very beginning, it's already falling apart. And very early in the book, it does fall apart. And Hadelin's own worries get played out in his own behavior at the end of the book when he holds Ehrenfall responsible for his lover's death. This brings me to the last point I want to think about in terms of the adjunct, and that is his death. And I think that death is actually itself used to explore something really important, which is a sort of heterosexual washing by history. And so, of course, we could accuse Erikson of falling into the bury your gaze trope, right, with Incarus's death. But I think that would be unfair in this particular instance for two reasons. And that's because of the way it's used, right? But the first one, actually, though, is that Incarus's soul is held back, right, by Vashaik. And with her death at the end, we're left sort of wondering if he'll be forgotten about, or if the being who compelled her to interrupt his passage towards death, who may or may not also be the one with the answers that she claims will answer his questions eventually, will pick up this thread in later books, right? So it's possible he's not dead yet, or he's dead, but he's not really gone from the narrative yet. So that sort of in-between state that is one of the wonderful affordances of fantasy does keep it from being that trope. But I think even if you were dead, the more important reason that this criticism doesn't apply here is that this his death scene is, to my mind, a brilliant comment on, more specifically, a sort of hetero washing of history, more largely the instability of historical interpretation itself, right? Of the interpretation of historical artifacts. And so I want to look at a couple of descriptions from that scene because this argument really depends upon how this is described in the novel. So if you'll remember that scene, Basically, the adjunct has been killed by one of the mercenaries that they've gone to sort of flush out, who have been, trafficking in children, basically, right? So the Malayan Empire has sent them. Aeronfall has gone himself. The adjunct decides he's going to go with him, perhaps because of this recent breakup, right? So it is, in some ways, it's actually confirming the ways that love for the adjunct causes him to make perhaps bad decisions. And so he is killed, and where he falls, he is sort of entangled, if you will, with the mercenary he killed and who killed him. And so we're very much reminded, if you will, explicitly of his love for Hadelin, right? So reminded specifically of this gay desire and this gay relationship. When he says on 256, he's talking to Aaronfall, tell Hadelin it was never his fault. Not any of it. Love who he will, tell him to never set aside the moment for a future promise. That promise may never come. To lose the present for a false future, it's wrong. And right, so I think both this reminder of the love and also this emphasis on the present, right, rather than the future, and arguably rather than particular interpretations of the past, which we'll get to, I think is really important. So I want to mention one final passage that's really important in thinking about this reading and what this reading and what this death is doing in this moment. And that is at the end of the scene when Fall is sort of left alone with the bodies, and he's going to be preserving them, right, in his warrens and his pocket warrens that he's been using for this. Proper tomb later. And that, of course, is probably tied a little bit to this possibility that he's going to be coming back, perhaps even bodily, if he's in this place without time. But he's there, and he's reflecting on the bodies, and this is what is described. As far as the internments went, he reflected, future generations, if ever stumbling upon their bodies, would surely mistake them for lovers, this man, this woman. So that idea, that's that hetero-washing, a man and a woman clasped together in death, they must be lovers, right? That's the only sort of type of relationship that the mind will immediately go to, even though there's so many other possibilities for why a woman and a man might be clasped together. And in their minds, they would nurture soft sentiments of love and loyalty, two souls bound as one, and this would ease their day. And every day they returned the imagined scene would add another comforting caress. And so this idea of taking solace, right, in this interpretation, the idea that in some ways people's interpretations of the past are about assuaging the pain of the present, right? And I think that's really important the way that's being pointed out. But then, finally it says, between the truth and the lie, Ehrenfall knew which he would choose were he able. So it was that one could envy the ignorant for all the right reasons. And this throws me off a bit. I gotta be clear. And I do think partially it's because Ehrenfall is that poet, right? Like he is very much romanticizing this idea of solace, this idea of using this historical clasp, embrace, if you will, to actually deal with present pain, and to use that idea of that romantic bond as something that can ease pain, which is fine. But he is very much wishing that he could hetero wash this, right? Like he's wishing that he was ignorant enough and envying those ignorant enough to just see this as two lovers, which of course very much erases Incurs's gay identity, right? So I find this a very interesting, ambiguous ending, but I do think it's being used for a purpose. And there's one more point I want to add with this. And I don't want to claim to have a lot of knowledge about this, only very internet knowledge, but I think there's a very direct comparison here to the Pompeii lovers, right? That collection of two sort of bodies preserved in the lava that sort of look like they're sort of clasped together, that have been interpreted as like a mother, a child, or two maidens, or now potentially a heterosexual couple, then perhaps a gay couple, because I think the latest thing was that they were two men. But I also want to notice the ways that these interpretations get framed, right? Like when it's believed to be two women, the assumption is a sort of mother daughter, like a non sexual bond, which very much actually speaks to the continuing erasure often of lesbian couples and lesbian desire, right? It's sort of hiding it under other female close relationships and bonds. And then the move when one is discovered to be a male to be, oh, well, now it's sexual because it's a man and a woman. And so you see that like compulsory sexuality and that compulsory heterosexuality in particular coming into the fore in how people are reading that image, those couples, that couple that's clasping together. And then we move to the potential of it being two men, and the sexual remains, which leaves us in compulsory sexuality because maybe they are friends, maybe they are two gay men, maybe they are friends, maybe they are strangers taking solace with each other because they know they're about to die. Like, we don't know. And I think this is very much what Erikson's playing with, is that tendency of historical interpretation in cases like this to create these narratives that tell us way more about us, way more about the viewer and what they want and what they need in the present than anything about the actual sort of historical individuals that we're looking at, preserved in the lava, and our tendency to create narratives over them, but self-serving narratives in interesting ways. And so even if Incarus Solet is fully dead, I think this point alone is worth this sort of hetero washing, right? It's worth the killing of the gay character to explore these issues that very much have to do with queerness and how queerness is recognized, made legible, understood, but within this larger context as well of broader sort of historical interpretation. And I really loved that scene because it just raises all of these things, but doesn't really side with any sort of particular interpretation. It's just opening, it's creating more discourse, more interpretations, not shutting them down. I think that's a really interesting way to sort of represent this. And, if he's back, that will then sort of push back against that, I think, in interesting ways. The other thing that I think is really useful and interesting about Arenthal's final thought is that, in a way, by stressing sort of the interpretation of a death, it's also connecting us back to Adjunct Warren's death again, which, if you'll recall, refuses Ganos's attempts to give it meaning, right? So in this case with the adjunct Incarus, that death is very actively, the meaning is being sort of overwritten in a way, in an imaginative way, whereas the attempts to give meaning to Adjunct Lorden's death fail, right? So to remind you a little bit, if it's been a while since Gardens of the Moon, briefly at the end there, right, Lorne goes after Crocus, right, in an attempt to kill the coin bearer. Crocus is being defended by members of the Crimson Guard who injure Lorne, and then as she's sort of coming away from that, escaping from them, because of course they will kill her if she presses the issue, she's finished off by Mies and Arilta, who are in service, to the eel, to Krupp, and she has no idea what to do with this. She has no idea what's going on. She has no idea who the eel is, and so thinks that she's died and has died, meaningless, or as I argue in another video, almost too much meaning in terms of her death, right? So on 635, you get this scene with Ganos, right? So this has all happened, and he comes upon Lorne dying in the street. And so, he found her there, and he watched her eyes flicker open. This is where I'm starting reading. She stared up at him as recognition arrived. Captain, Ganos, Adjunct. They have killed me. Who? She managed a stained smile. I don't know. Two women. Looked like thieves, thugs. Do you see the irony, Ganos Perrin? Thin-lipped, he nodded. No glorious end for the adjunct. If you'd come a few minutes sooner. The captain said nothing. He watched the life leave Lorne, feeling nothing. This idea that in Gardens of the Moon, you have this almost overdetermined death in that there's so many factors that sort of come into it, but none of them have meanings that are available for Lorne or for Ganos, right? And so they're forced to sort of throw up their hands and be like, well, I guess there's no meaning here, right? There's no glorious end. There's no, and of course, as the reader, there's too many meanings. Like we can slowly pick together and see all of the parts that went into this sort of overdetermined death. But then in No Life Forsaken, again, there's a sense of randomness, a sense of a lack of meaning in that, why was Incris solid there? Why did he insist on joining the fight? And these things are emphasized, right, as this scene is talked about in various ways throughout the book. But you have Fall giving it meaning, even though he recognizes that that meaning is false, that desire to give meaning that is very much of his character, right? To be the poet, to be the storyteller, to give comfort in some way, even if it's not for himself, right? And so that element I think is a really interesting as well link between these two as we continue to see these different explorations of the adjunct figure. So my final point for this video, and thank you if you're still around, or if you jumped to this section also, that's fair, valid. I want to talk about Corporal Hasten Thenu, or I should say Corporal, not a Corporal, Hasten Thenu. Who is he? And certainly there's others who probably agree with this. I'm not claiming that this is an incredibly original interpretation of this figure, although I have seen different ones. But I wanted to sort of marshal my evidence here because I do think there's actually a lot of evidence to basically signify, to point us to the fact that this is indeed quick Ben. And it's not just the pun. It's not quick and hasten. I mean, that's part of it. We know that the Marines do love these sort of clever, almost sort of similar names. Like we had Fiddler turn into Strings, right? So to think quick Ben turning into Hasten Thenu, that makes some sense. But that's just on the surface. There's much more evidence that it's him throughout. And so I'm just going to go quickly through this in terms of what we can do with our corporal, who I really hope to see more of in the next books. First off, he saw the Starry Eel do the shadow dance. That is mentioned, and certainly Quick Ben is not the only person who has seen that, but we do know for certain that he has seen her dance earlier, right, in his career. Believe, if I'm remembering correctly, correct me if I'm wrong, you can, it's when he's actually still a priest of shadow, right? So this idea of him seeing her do the shadow dance is one of the first sort of elements that people tend to point to that I've seen in other comments. But I think there's a lot more than that. We also look at the little bit of physical descriptions we get of the characters. So he's described in the prologue as gesturing with a long fingered hand, and compare that to the thin spidery hands and almost feminine hands that we get in Gardens of the Moon about him. Certainly he's described as thin, acidic features. We have thin eyebrows in No Life Forsaken. So there's just some of these small gestures. We don't get a lot of physical description. When do we ever really with Erikson? But there are these similarities if we're just looking at it on a physical. And note that his skin color is never described. And I think that's intentional as well. I think Erikson is hoping that will default to that sort of whiteness of fantasy, maybe using that against people in a way to sort of hide what's going on. He also, Hasten Thenu, that is, moves through multiple warrens. He has access to a number of warrens. He's described as awakening a few warrens, but he's not a healer, right? And Quick Ben is not a healer. And so we have, when he is healing Fall after Fall's like the assassination attempt, he has to use mundane magic because despite the fact that he's so powerful that he actually doesn't want to reveal himself fully in Gdanispan for fear of creating a convergence, despite that, and his access to so many warrens, he can't heal, right? And so the convergence as well is like a hint that we're speaking about someone who is intensely powerful. Again, fits Quick Ben. He's also referred to by Calor in the prologue as having lived many lives, and we could think about this both as the souls that Quick Ben absorbed, but also this greater power or link to the Tistandi that's hinted at the end of Book of the Fallen. And I'm really hoping that means he'll show up in Carcanis. We'll see. That would be really interesting. One that I definitely noticed, though, because I've spoken about this in the video on homosexual representation in the Malazan Book of the Fallen, is that it's my headcanon that Quick Ben is asexual. And there's a number of pieces of evidence, very slight, very small, but they're there in that main 10 that make him legible as such. And this is actually returned back to in No Life Forsaken, where he, again, it's a hint, it's not explicit, it's never explicit, but there is that sense that he is very much legible as an asexual character, to my mind, linking him with Quick Ben. And it's sort of, I know this might be a little bit more of a tenuous one, so I'm going to read just that quick section where we see that, which is on page 65. And so this is when he's sort of conferring with Aaronfall. They're in a place that is a former bathhouse, right? And they're looking at a map, they're talking about plans and whatnot. So we have like the corporal coming in, and then we have this description, quote, Aaronfall studied him briefly, then said, the decor does not disturb you. Thin brows lifted as the man paused and made a visual examination of the room as if for the first time. No, it's fine, sir. The frescoes. We're surrounded by capering nudes. Yes, well, I've seen worse. Aaronfall frowned, not distracted even in the least. Only where the limbs look wrong. The artist wasn't very good. As for the commissioner's taste in flesh, I really have no comment either way. You're a strange one, Corporal. Yes, sir. And so, again, not conclusive, but certainly suggestive and certainly legible as asexual in the same way in Malazan Book of the Fallen, Quick Ben is as well. Hasten Thenu is also someone that the Marines consider they should report the presence of an Azath to, again, leading that sort of question of what knowledge he has, what do they know about him? I mean, certainly they know he's not a corporal, but we never get a sense of if they know exactly who he is. But the final sort of most explicit thing, and I think this is because we're supposed to have caught on by now, is when he uses shadow to hold on to Bornu Blat's soul when it's expelled from Blat's body by Vashaik. And so I want to read this section as a sort of a final like wrap up point for this theory that Hasten Thenu is indeed Quick Ben. So when the soul and the shadow are talking, we have the soul of Bornu Blat beginning here. Quote, who are you? And in response, oh, many things, many names, but Hasten will do for now. I was once a priest of shadow. In fact, I've worn the holy robes of more gods and more temples than I care to count, though I admit a singular fondness for shadow, and not because of Shadow Throne or the rope, but because of its essence, which I'll get to in a moment, or not. Which is a wonderfully Quick Ben thing to say, right? I mean, keeping aside that we know he was a former High Priest of Shadow, that we've gotten these hints that he has a link to Mother Dark in some way, even though we don't fully understand what that is. But even that final thing, perhaps I'll explain or not. I mean, we know that character, it's been both a pleasure and a frustration throughout the Malazan Book of the Fallen, does not like to explain plans, right? Very, very little comes by way of explanation from Quick Ben unless sort of forced to the issue. He always has plans, he's always working behind the scenes, there's always stuff going on, but he's not one to really explain it, which is why I find it so very interesting that he is purportedly the narrator, right? He's the one telling this tale to Cotillion, which is what we get right at the start during the prologue. If anything, that sort of should be an indication to us that this book is incomplete, right? That what we're getting is only what we're being allowed to have by a storyteller who is not known for his expansive storytelling, expressiveness, if you will. He's not known for, he's not a Krupp, he's not a talker, he's not a revealer of truths or secrets. He's very much someone who reveals the knowledge that has to be known in the moment and nothing more, right? So I think it's quite interesting, and I hope that it's something that plays out in the next two books. Is there a reason for this, right? Is there going to be something later that causes us to reflect back on this book, to see the ways that we've been manipulated by the particular person, Corporal, not Corporal Hasten Thenu, or Quick Ben, who's telling this story? And frankly, I do think that by this point, we're meant to know, right? Like, if it isn't Quick Ben, this is sort of the biggest baiting in terms of a character I've seen ever in a fantasy novel. And it will take a lot of very good explaining for me to buy it if he's not, because it just seems like there's so many things that add up that I feel like we are supposed to know even before we get to this point where we ask with along with Born Black, who are you? We are supposed to already, I think, have a very strong sense of the answer to that question. And yet it's still, to me, very satisfying that we're not given it definitively. I'm sure we will be later. Well, actually, maybe I'm not sure. I hope we will be later. But I do think that there's enough sort of clues there, breadcrumbs, callbacks to sort of earlier things from the Book of the Fallen 10 that we are meant to know at this point that it is Quick Ben we're looking at. And if we're not, there's a reason. I'll trust Erikson that there's a reason if it turns out to be someone else. So that's it for me. If you've made it this far, thank you so much for watching. Whether you skipped through certain parts or watched the whole thing, I very much appreciate it. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe. If you want more Malazan content, let me know. If you want other content, let me know. I'm hoping to make, I feel like I say this at the end of every video, but I am hoping to make more videos a little more frequently in the next year or so. So we'll see how that goes. The best laid plans. Otherwise, thanks very much.